Imagine giving someone a massive budget to protect your money, only to find out they're paying someone else millions to do the job while your savings mysteriously vanish.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like the premise of a financial thriller or something. But this is actually a real-time debate happening right now over public funds, and the mechanics of it get incredibly complicated very fast.
Right. Well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are looking at a huge stack of sources today. We've got opinion pieces, some news excerpts, and a YouTube commentary by Nellie Miranda. And they are all focusing on the intense scrutiny currently facing New York Attorney General Letitia James.
And it is important to note right off the bat that, a lot of this pressure is being driven by right-leaning critics. So political opponents, basically.
Exactly. And our mission here, just to be totally clear, isn't to validate the politics or take a side. We're just going to pop the hood on the actual math and examine the conservative arguments driving these headlines. Because the numbers they're pointing to are pretty shocking.
Oh, absolutely. The data is what makes this so fascinating.
Yeah.
We want to understand what these critics are seeing, look at the ledgers, and figure out how the state enforcement is supposedly just breaking down.
So let's just get right into the news hook here, because the headlines are moving fast. Basically, critics are sounding a massive alarm over nearly $20 million of taxpayer money. Money that is just flowing out of the state budget to private law firms.
Yeah, 20 million. It's a huge number.
It is. And at the exact same time, the state's Medicaid fraud investigations plunged 45%. And the actual cash they recovered from those fraudsters, that number plummeted from $168 million down to just $31 million.
Right. And I mean, those are not minor statistical dips. We are talking about massive structural drops in active enforcement. Right. When you see numbers plunge that dramatically, people naturally start looking for the leaks in the system.
Which means we really need to figure out where the taxpayer money is actually going right now. If you look at the state's ledgers, millions of dollars are flowing to these outside private law firms. Yeah.
But the New York Attorney General's office employs hundreds of full-time attorneys. I mean, their entire job is to represent the state.
Right. They have a massive in-house team.
Exactly. So mechanically speaking, why would an attorney general with that massive in-house legal team need to spend nearly $20 million on private outside counsel? It's like hiring a full-time, really expensive in-house plumbing team, but then, I don't know, paying an outside contractor millions of dollars every single time a pipe leaks.
That's a great analogy, actually. And to understand the controversy, you first have to understand the standard justification for hiring these outside firms. Because usually, yes, the Attorney General's office uses its own lawyers.
Right.
But there are specific situations where using your own lawyers creates a legal conflict of interest. So, for example, if the state is being sued by one of its own employees, like in a workplace harassment suit.
Okay. Having the state's own lawyers handle that defense can cross some serious ethical and legal lines. So in those instances, the office is often required, or at least strongly advised, to hire independent outside counsel to just handle the case impartially.
Okay, so the underlying mechanism for hiring outside help makes sense, in certain specific scenarios. But the criticism in these documents isn't just that outside firms were hired.
No, not at all.
It's about who got hired and the sheer volume of taxpayer money changing hands here.
Precisely. And this is where the conservative viewpoint really sharpens its focus on the issue. You have critics like Sartha Kateretti, she's a former federal prosecutor and a Republican challenger to Letitia James.
Right. She's been very vocal in these sources.
Very vocal. And she points directly at these funds. Kateretti singles out a $10 million portion of this spending, and she literally calls it a legal defense fund for James's personal and political troubles.
Wow. A legal defense fund.
Yeah. The conservative argument is that relying on these ultra-expensive private firms for issues that shouldn't necessarily require them is just an insult to taxpayers, especially taxpayers who are already dealing with sky-high living costs.
But wait, campaign donations from law firms happen all the time in politics, right? It's practically a feature of the system. The documents note that around 145 lawyers from these hired outside firms gave a combined $23,000 to James's political campaign.
Yeah, the donations are definitely part of the record.
So if the office says this is just politically motivated criticism, purely objectively, doesn't handing taxpayer money to firms that donated to your campaign create a massive perception problem when it comes to public trust?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's no smoking gun of an illegal quid pro quo, right? And Letitia James completely denies any wrongdoing. She calls the attacks purely political. But the critics argue that in government finance, The appearance of a conflict is often just as damaging as an actual conflict. Nellie Miranda's commentary hits heavily on this. Even if it is standard political maneuvering, routing millions in taxpayer dollars to firms that employ your campaign donors fundamentally erodes public trust.
And the documents provide a very specific case study for this, which is wild. There's a prominent firm called Davis Polk and Wardwell LLP. The state put them on a $575,000 retainer to represent the Attorney General's office in a sexual harassment suit filed by a former aide.
Right, the retainer.
And the optics get incredibly tangled here because Governor Kathy Hochul's husband makes roughly $1.3 million a year at that exact same firm.
Yeah, that detail gets brought up a lot by the critics. Now, the records do clarify that the governor's husband does not work on matters involving the state.
Oh, okay. So there's a firewall.
Exactly. He is firewalled from that work. But when you look at the mechanics of a $575,000 retainer, you see why taxpayers balk. A retainer isn't just a bill for services rendered,
Right. It's like a down payment.
It's an upfront reservation of highly specialized, incredibly expensive corporate lawyers who often charge upwards of $1,000 an hour. So when a government agency writes that kind of check to a firm deeply connected to the state's political elite, the critics argue it looks less like a necessary legal expense and more like an insular wealth transfer.
That makes sense. And I mean, if you are draining $20 million from the budget for outside corporate counsel, that money isn't paying for internal resources. It's not paying for investigators.
No, it's gone.
And we see the direct result of that when we look at the Medicaid enforcement numbers, which brings us to the second big piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, and to understand the sheer scale of the failure critics are pointing to here, you have to understand the size of the program itself. New York has the second largest Medicaid budget in the entire country.
Behind only California.
Exactly, sitting just behind California. We are talking about tens of billions of public dollars moving through the system every single year.
Okay, before we get to the failure rates, though, how does Medicaid fraud actually happen? Give us a clear picture of what these investigators are supposed to be catching. Because it isn't like, someone is robbing a hospital with a ski mask.
Right, exactly. It's white-collar theft. And it relies on exploiting the bureaucracy of the billing system. So the two most common mechanisms you'll see are phantom billing and upcoding.
Phantom billing. Okay, what's that?
Phantom billing is exactly what it sounds like. A clinic or a provider bills Medicaid for tests, equipment, or patient visits that simply never happen. They just make it up.
Wow. And what about upcoding? That sounds a bit more sneaky.
It is slightly more insidious, yeah. A provider might do a basic, say, 5-minute telehealth check-in with a patient.
Mm-hmm.
But they code it in the billing software as a 45-minute complex medical consultation.
Oh, I see. Which pays out way more.
Significantly more. It drains the system fast.
So catching that requires incredibly tedious forensic auditing. I mean, you have to match patient records with billing codes, track down discrepancies, prove intent. It's a lot of work.
It's a massive amount of work.
And the statistics in these documents show that New York is basically not doing that work anymore. When measured per $1 billion spent, out of 50 states, New York's fraud unit ranks 48th in investigations, 49th in indictments, and dead last 50th in convictions.
Dead last. Think about that. When you manage the second largest pool of medical welfare funds in America, but you rank at the absolute bottom for catching the people siphoning off those funds, critics view it as a systemic structural failure.
Yeah, and the drop in recovered cash is what really stands out to me. Like in 2019, the state recovered $168 million from fraudsters. By 2024, that number vanished down to just $31 million.
It's a staggering drop.
But wait, I want to challenge the timeline here for a second based on the sources. The documents mention that there was a broader national decline in fraud investigations during these exact same years.
That's true.
So isn't it kind of unfair to blame this entirely on New York's leadership? I mean, New York was the absolute epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed, normal operations halted, and emergency funds were just flying out the door. Couldn't that account for the disproportionate drop in investigations?
It's a really crucial point. And the pandemic absolutely disrupted auditing protocols nationwide. Federal regulators actually eased oversight temporarily just to keep the healthcare system functioning during the crisis.
Right, which makes sense.
But when you dig into the comparative data, the math really isolates New York. While national investigation numbers did shrink, the national decrease was only about a third of the massive drop seen in New York.
Oh. Meaning if it was purely pandemic fallout, New York's numbers should have mirrored the national average, or at least bounded back as the pandemic ended.
Exactly. Instead, the plunge in New York was 3 times worse than the rest of the country. And the recovery numbers have stayed down. You cannot blame a permanent 45% plunge entirely on a temporary national crisis when the rest of the country stabilized.
Okay, I see.
And that is exactly why conservative critics argue the problem is localized entirely to New York's specific leadership and how they choose to allocate their investigative resources.
Right, which brings us to the why. If the state is failing to catch phantom billing, where's the focus going? The conservative argument presented in our sources suggests that Attorney General James is neglecting this tedious state-level fraud because she's only interested in pursuing high-profile, headline-grabbing national cases.
Yes, the high-profile distraction argument.
It's like, imagine a comic book superhero, right? They only fight galactic supervillains so they can get their name in the newspaper. But they completely ignore the pickpockets who are emptying the citizens' wallets right on the street. The galactic villain fight makes the news and builds profile, but the pickpockets are what actually bankrupt the people living in the city.
That metaphor perfectly captures the criticism here. Auditing medical clinics for upcoding is unglamorous. It requires rooms full of accountants staring at spreadsheets for months on end.
Yeah, it doesn't get a politician on primetime cable news.
Exactly. But it is the essential, foundational work required to protect the state budget. The critics argue that James has built a national reputation by portraying herself as a crusader on the biggest possible stage, while basically allowing the everyday machinery of state protection to completely rust over.
And this isn't just a local debate anymore either. The documents bring in quotes from Vice President J.D. Vance to show how this local failure fits into a much broader national context, specifically regarding the Trump administration's focus on fraud prevention.
Yeah, Vance uses this exact kind of enforcement collapse to outline a very specific conservative philosophy about who actually gets hurt when government waste is ignored.
Right. And he frames it around the concept of two distinct victims, doesn't he?
He does. The first victim is the American taxpayer. When you look at your paycheck and see the taxes taken out, you are paying into a system under the social contract that the money will be managed carefully.
That'll be used to actually support your community.
Exactly. So when bad actors are allowed to siphon that money away through things like phantom billing, they are essentially stealing directly from the taxpayer's labor.
And the second victim is the person on the other end of that safety net. It's the low-income family, or the child who actually needs that subsidized medical care or food assistance.
That is the real tragedy of it. The system is not a bottomless pit of money. When fraudsters treat public programs like a personal ATM, it physically shrinks the safety net. There are fewer resources available, fewer hospital beds subsidized, and just less support for the people who genuinely rely on those programs to survive. The system is compromised from the inside out.
Because it fundamentally alters the resources available in a community. I think people often think of government waste as just, a spreadsheet error in a distant capital somewhere.
Right, like it's just abstract math.
Exactly. But what Vance and these conservative critics are arguing is that ignoring fraud directly removes resources from local hospitals and community clinics. It has a real-world impact.
And this broader scrutiny is happening because the public's tolerance for financial mismanagement has really just bottomed out. Following the massive historic waves of fraud we saw in COVID relief programs and unemployment benefits over the last few years, voters are actively looking at the ledgers now.
Yeah, the days of just assuming tax dollars are spent responsibly are over.
The expectation that public agencies are rigorously guarding the vault is completely gone. People want accountability.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. We looked at the nearly $20 million flowing out of the state budget to private law firms. We talked about the mechanical conflict of interest arguments surrounding campaign donors and political optics.
We examined the complete collapse in Medicaid enforcement, too, with New York ranking dead last in convictions despite managing the second largest budget in the country.
Yeah, that stat is still crazy to me. And we explored the conservative argument that prioritizing high-profile political battles leaves everyday public resources totally vulnerable to theft.
When you look at the raw data, the drop from 168 million to just 31 million in recoveries, it really forces a difficult conversation about the structural integrity of these public institutions. It comes down to whether the mechanics of oversight are actually functioning or if they've been quietly dismantled.
It really challenges us to look past the political theater and examine the actual math of how our communities are managed. So, we want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder based on the source material we explored today.
Wow.
If a state with the second largest budget in America ranks dead last in protecting that money, what happens to the foundation of these vital safety nets if this level of enforcement becomes the new normal nationwide?